Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Tom Arnold Forster, and I'm a Career Development Fellow here at the RAI. And it's a real pleasure to introduce and chair this evening's roundtable on liberalism, conservatism, and reception history. So we're very lucky to have three scholars here who each published major recent books about John Locke, Edmund Burke, and Adam Smith. And so I'm just going to introduce them briefly, and then we'll get into the discussion. So first we have Emily Jones here, who is a lecturer in modern history at the University of Manchester. She's the author of Edmund Burke and the Invention of Modern Conservatism, 1830 to 1914, an Intellectual History. It was published by Oxford in 2017, and it won the 2018 Longman's History Today Prize and was an FT Book of the Year. She's currently completing a monograph provisionally titled One Nation, the Disraeli Myth and the Making of a Conservative Tradition. And then next in the middle, we have Claire Rydell Arcenas, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Montana. Her first book, America's Philosopher, John Locke in American Intellectual Life, published by Chicago in 2022, won the 2022 István Hont Book Prize. And she's currently writing a book about the Declaration of Independence, American democracy, and civic education in the United States from 1776 to 2026. And this year, Claire is also a fellow in residence here at the RAI and a Plummer Fellow at St Anne's College. And then at the end there is Glory Liu, who's the Assistant Director for the Centre for Economy and Society and an Assistant Research Professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Her first book, Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism, was published by Princeton in 2022, and it received the 2024 Best Monograph Award from the European Society for the History of Economic Thought. And she's currently working on a new project about Asian American political thought before the invention of Asian America. So the plan for tonight is for each of our panelists to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes about how their experiences of writing reception history has informed their writing about the histories of liberalism and conservatism more broadly. And then I hope we'll get the panelists to briefly respond to each other before opening the floor for questions. I think we have a few colleagues joining us on Zoom. So if you are there and you have questions, please put them in the chat and I will do my best to field them as well. And then we'll finish at 7 for drinks reception just up there. So Claire, do you want to kick us off?
Gladly. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for those warm introductions. And thank you all for being here this evening. I'm delighted to once again return to the Rothermere American Institute, one of the most sort of vibrant intellectual communities of which I've ever been a part. And I'm also now just thrilled to be joined by two of my, we'll say, intellectual idols, Emily and Glory. I'm very much looking forward to tonight's conversation. So to begin this evening by saying that I will talk about Locke, liberalism, and the United States, maybe enough to send all of you out the door immediately to the pint that awaits you all. What could there be left to say? And who cares? For 3/4 of a century, hardly a year has passed without some work connecting the 17th century English philosopher to the political ideology with which he is most closely associated. And Lockean liberalism, as it's so often called, is either taken for granted as the core of what in the 20th century becomes known as the American political tradition, or rejected, usually in favor of some other ism, often republicanism. And yet, I think that sort of contemplating the United States, more specifically its history, liberalism, more specifically its mutability, and Locke, more specifically his American reception or influence, may prove useful still. So I've spent most of my academic career considering the influence of John Locke in the United States and before it, the North American colonies over the past 300 plus years. To a certain extent, this means I've also spent the same period thinking about liberalism, conservatism, libertarianism, etc., but not in ways that are immediately obvious. And indeed, I must say up front just how easy it is to forget entirely about liberalism, or for that matter, any ism, when thinking historically about Locke's influence in American intellectual life before about 1940. So how to answer the questions guiding our present discussion, has thinking and writing about Locke in America shaped how I think about writing And here we may also include teaching histories of liberalism and its relations. Framed in slightly broader terms, what does the perspective of so-called reception history, a term I hope we may also complicate a bit this evening, what does the perspective of reception history provide? So in the time I have now, let me offer just 2 points in response to these questions, focusing on Locke and liberalism in particular, although I think we can say a lot about Locke and conservatism as well. Maybe we'll get there in the conversation. So first, I think Locke's American story reveals the payoffs of interrogating rather than simply identifying, acknowledging moments of invention or becoming in liberalism's history. Second, it reveals liberalism's potential to serve not only as an object of inquiry and investigation, but also as a heuristic tool, something that precisely because it is an invented construct, we can use to better understand the past. So it is now quite clear, at least to those receptive to such arguments, that Locke became liberal in the 20th century, and that it was not until the mid-20th century that liberalism, as a political ideology committed to the flourishing of individual freedom, liberty, and Locke became inextricably linked. So this recognition is of vital importance because it reveals that the construct Lockean liberalism was just that, right? An invention, a creation of a particular time and place, specifically a 20th century political intellectual universe bent on resisting the rising threats of totalitarianism and communism to liberal democracy worldwide. A narrow focus on this notion of invention, however, poses 2 risks for historians. First is the risk of introducing elements of ahistorical inevitability to the story of both Locke's influence and American liberalism, or perhaps liberalisms, as they emerged and transformed over time. Second is the risk of becoming so reliant on the object of inquiry, say the category of liberal or liberalism, that it becomes the only lens through which we encounter the past. So shifting focus away from the ism to an associated thinker, and especially in my case, the reception, influence, or impact of the thinker provides a way to interrogate rather than just acknowledge or observe invention and transformation of liberalism's past. So one form such work can take is what Peter Ghosh has done quite recently, very beautifully for John Stuart Mill, that is ask who Mill was before liberalism to reveal a thinker in his own life, world, and work infinitely more complex and interesting than the one most familiar to us in the 21st century. Another approach, and the one I take in my book, and I think we've collectively taken our books together, is to ask who a thinker, in my case Locke, was, not as a historical subject himself, but who he was for a group of people, in my case Americans, before liberalism. Here, the issue at stake is not just how and why does Locke become liberal, with attention to the messiness therein, but what existed before and what we might learn from it. Such an inquiry entails simultaneously letting go of liberalism, freeing oneself from the bonds of categories, concerns, and priorities of the recent past to investigate a sort of deeper past, and at the same time holding on to liberalism as a point of reference and comparison to make sense of what separates but also unites past and present. Okay, so what does this look like for Locke? So on his way to becoming a modifier for the term liberalism, to becoming, in a word, liberal, Locke was many different things to Americans. Before Locke became, in the 20th century, a massive national cliche, I quote here, as Harvard historian Louis Hartz put it in his monumental The Liberal Tradition in America, published in 1955, he was in the 18th and 19th centuries of a very different relevance to American men and women who followed his recommendations for child rearing, Bible reading, commonplacing, friend making, community organizing, and reasoning. In the 18th century, people revered the great Mr. Locke, as they knew him, as an exemplar and model, an immediate presence in their everyday lives. They devoured the 2 works of Locke's that Americans in the 18th century knew best, his essay concerning human understanding, and some thoughts concerning education. These early Americans who reveled in the mundane details of Locke's life and character knew Locke best not for his political thought, say the 2 treatises of government, but for his penetrating insights into human understanding and his ability being an exemplar and model in addition to esteemed philosopher and author, to inculcate in Americans virtuous character development. Now, this isn't to say that Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries did not read or engage with Locke's political writings. They absolutely did. But they didn't read Locke's political work in isolation, nor, more importantly, did they understand it after the 1770s as a positive, continuing influence on American political intellectual life. In the early Republic and antebellum United States, and into the 19th century, the later period as well, when it came to politics and political thinking, Americans actually knew Locke primarily as a negative, that is a bad exemplar and model. Beginning in the 1780s and across the entirety of the 19th century, the primary way Americans engaged with and encountered Locke's political thought and political related writings was as evidence for two related points. First, thanks to his apparent and utterly disastrous involvement in crafting a constitution for the English colony of Carolina in the 1660s, they understood Locke as proving the unfortunately all too frequent incompatibility of political theory and political practice. Seizing on Locke's shortcomings in practice, they juxtaposed them with the philosopher's celebrated reputation in other areas, for example, epistemology, to argue that political theorizing, no matter how good and no matter how wise its theorizer, could and indeed did often fail. In so doing, they contributed to, and I think even invented, a very American emphasis on the importance of practical political experience in contradistinction to abstract theorizing. Second, they saw Locke and his political philosophy contained in the two treatises specifically as evidence of outdated and, in their eyes, misguided, even unscientific political thinking from a distant world where people interested in the origins or nature of government undertook thought experiments such as imagining a state of nature or a social contract. It was precisely this sort of approach that modern social science was busily replacing. What this meant was that by the turn of the 20th century, Locke and his political theory was seen as something fundamentally belonging to the past with little relevance for or bearing on the present. In the early part of the 20th century, between about 1910 and 1940, this began to change as Americans started to see Locke as possibly having a kind of relevance for questions and concerns of the 20th century. But they didn't yet have a clear sense of, or perhaps more accurately, a clear consensus or agreement on what this relevance of Locke was. Was Locke a proto-capitalist or a proto-socialist? Was he best understood as a kind of small L liberal whose relevance was chiefly in the realm of safeguarding individual freedom, or an advocate of what some commentators were beginning to term capital L liberalism, with both a more expansive understanding of the government's role in fostering such freedom and a recognition that any desired economic, legal, and political rights existed only alongside correlative duties that promoted the community's well-being? Was whatever lasting influence Locke had in the 20th century something to be celebrated or something to be concerned about? These were real live questions Americans asked about Locke's relevance in this first part of the 20th century, and they reveal, right, that before becoming fixed in both meaning and significance, Locke's relationship to liberalism, or any political ideology for that matter, was muddled in even contentious topic, debated and disagreed upon. All of this essentially disappears in the 1940s. During and then immediately sort of following World War II, Americans desperate for a non-Soviet, non-French, non-German great book seized on Locke's second treatise, divorcing it from its historical context, as well as from Locke's other works, and they distilled Locke into a few key passages from it. In so doing, they invented a new Locke, the liberal Locke, author of the decidedly pro-capitalist, pro-individualist second treatise, who could stand in opposition to political extremes of socialism, communism, totalitarianism, fascism, etc., and a shorthand for a uniquely American strain of liberal democracy. As a result, by the 1950s, for Americans, Locke was best understood as the political thinker-author of the second treatise and a kind of icon, a political abstraction connected most directly to a political tradition of liberalism. and the wide range of Locke's other writings and expertise on education or human understanding or commonplace bookkeeping was set aside and forgotten. So when later 20th century historians, who with the so-called Republican turn in historiography on the American founding, challenged Locke's legacies and sought to decenter Locke and liberalism from the story of the nation's origins, they were responding not to Locke as he was in the 18th or 19th centuries, but who he had become in the 20th. The same can be said for Leo Strauss, Wilmore Kendall, and Russell Kirk, who arrived on the scene in the 1950s and 1960s, seeking to reorient attention away from Locke to ancient or at least pre-modern commitments to more traditional institutions, societal bonds, to correct what they saw as the failings of Locke and liberalism with its celebration of atomistic individualism. And indeed, much is the same in the 21st century, as Locke and Lockean liberalism have again come under attack from the post-liberal new right, who tend to focus on only one tiny piece of the Lockean puzzle, as it were, some choice passages from the second treatise, ignoring other aspects of Locke's thought, such as his emphasis on the role of the family, especially parents, or his deep religiosity. So interrogating the process by which Locke became liberal and thinking beyond the moment of invention itself allows us to see two things more clearly. First, it calls our attention to the moments in between, right? The times when Locke's relevance, meaning, and future were decidedly not fixed, and thus creates space for a richer understanding of liberalism's 20th century transformations, its messiness, its pluralities. Second, it reveals the actual way Americans of the 18th and 19th centuries engaged with and used Locke, not to advance atomistic individualist agendas designed to protect, say, minimal government or private property accumulation, but rather to nurture virtuous character development in citizens who would constitute and could contribute beneficially to the body politic. This picture is impossible to see, I think, if the questions we ask about Locke in the 18th century, say, are guided only by perspectives of the 20th and 21st centuries, namely questions that read back onto the past, Locke's contemporary significance as a philosopher of liberalism and author of the two treatises. Ergo, we must let go of liberalism. At the same time, Locke's contemporary significance, holding on to liberalism, can help us frame, explain, and interpret the significance of these historical discoveries. For dramatic transformations in Locke's importance show a fundamental revolution of the ways in which Americans thought about how to build a good and just society, the issue really at the heart of any ism, from an emphasis on the moral character of individuals in the 18th and 19th centuries to the strength and durability of democratic institutions in the 20th. Two components, I would venture today, are absolutely essential in our present moment, perhaps now more than ever. So to return to where I began just a few minutes ago, the process then of uncovering Locke's American story also suggests to me that liberalism can be more than an object of investigation and inquiry. It can serve as a heuristic tool, something, again, precisely because it is a construct we might use to further our historical understanding. Through reception history, then, liberalism can serve as an intellectual invitation, a spur to different ways of asking and answering questions about the past. I will leave it there and pass the baton to my right.
So yeah, just to reiterate, thank you all for coming. Thank you to Tom and to Adam and the RAI for adopting our event. This was originally conceived about a year ago, basically just to get the three of us in a room together, and I am so happy that this has actually happened. But I'm primarily a British historian, so I'm an interloper here. So if you don't know who I am, a long time ago, I became interested in the question of how Edmund Burke, so the 18th century Irishman, Whig politician, so not a Tory, generally chastised after his death in 1797 as inconsistent, as a madman, a potential kind of Catholic convert on his deathbed. all bad things then, obviously. Gained his modern reputation as the founder of modern conservatism, often distilled to kind of neat little bullet points like hatred of revolutionary change and kind of support of gradual reform. Doing this required understanding not just how a Whig could become a conservative and so kind of aligned with Toryism, and from there to be seen as relevant to modern politics, but also how Burke's Irishness, his madness, his inconsistency was reinterpreted so that he could be seen as a consistent, important political thinker. But as it turned out, as we've kind of already kind of heard, it wasn't just about how Burke's reputation was reinvented, but how Burkean conservatism as a kind of distinctive intellectual and political tradition was kind of constructed and circulated at the turn of the 20th century. I've also just submitted for review my second book manuscript that looks at the posthumous career of the Conservative Prime Minister and novelist Benjamin Disraeli following his death in 1881. Some of you might know that Disraeli was widely criticised during his lifetime for his supposed opportunism, lack of principle, slipperiness, often rooted in ideas of Orientalism and anti-Semitism. Yet he's now most commonly encountered as the founder of a distinct kind of socially minded tradition of conservatism that we usually refer to as a nation. Again, this required not only understanding how the historic Disraeli's politics were reshaped in order to speak to modern political issues and kind of legitimate particular policy proposals, but how his Jewishness was reimagined, how his novels became seen as significant historical and political texts, which meant that Disraeli became not only a canonical source of conservative principles and statesmanship with a big C, but as with Burke, the founder or sometimes with Disraeli, prophet of an alternative, though complementary strand of conservatism. Sometimes they could be platted together or kind of separately picked up and put down. So in terms of what I have learned about conservatism or liberalism, firstly, I would say that predominantly I've kind of worked on Britain, although my work does address European and some North American reputations as well. And in some cases, what kinds of particularly with Disraeli, what kinds of transnational exchange occur. I think with that said, I think the main things that I would stress would be, the things that I've learned would be the fundamentally relational and kind of historically contingent nature of the traditions that I've studied, the importance of broader, non or less explicitly partisan sources and contexts, and in particular the importance of historical reconstruction as providing a fundamental cement of individual and group political and intellectual identity, or identities for much of the period covered. I'll start with the sources point. So I think 99% of people think I work on the Conservative Party, or at least conservatism quite narrowly conceived. But in my work, I have entire chapters, sometimes multiple chapters, where there are either no conservatives or political identities are fluid. I've already mentioned how examining the transformation of Burke and Disraeli's conservative reputations also involved looking at changing understandings of Irishness and Jewishness. A number of Burke's early critical recoverers who sought to rescue him from those charges of inconsistency were liberal men of letters. A great deal of Labour politicians, Marxists and socialists, not only in Britain but elsewhere in Europe, identified in Disraeli, and particularly in his 1845 novel Civic, a kind of nascent if limited source of socialist inspiration. And across the political spectrum, history and historical reconstruction was not simply a convenient source of political legitimation or a kind of prop, but a genuinely constructive intellectual force for imagining the past, the present, and the future. But this work wasn't done within a vacuum. Hence, alongside political sources, I've also looked at history and English literature curricula, examinations, textbooks, literary criticism, historical plays, Hollywood films, I think that's some of that speaks to both of your books as well, maybe not the films, but yeah.
I wish.
Yeah, there's still biopics to be told about Edmund Burke, John Locke, and Adam Smith, I'm sure.
We'll make our own.
Because the historical reconstruction of conservative figures like Burke and Disraeli, as well as the invention of broad-up strands, or whatever you want to call them, of conservatism, have by no means been the exclusive work of figures within who identify themselves as being within that tradition or ideology. So it's obviously a bit of a truism to say that, you know, we can't have a history of one political party when they exist within a two or a multi-party system, whether or not this is actually enacted in practice. But I think it's less common to hear that about political ideologies or isms, and I think we can probably all think of recent examples that still kind of go, like vertical histories that still kind of go from A to Z or Z. Both of my books have brought home this relational nature quite vividly. So in Burke's case, for example, so once he'd been recovered as a consistent, important thinker, primarily by liberal intellectuals, his political moment came in Irish Home Law debates from 1886. So the Liberal Prime Minister, William Gladstone, basically comes out in Parliament and says, I've been using Burke to come to my conclusions, and so should you. And they actually do. So kind of, you know, people, you know, all kinds of people who are, you know, very, you know, very, very kind of frantically reading Burke at this time, all start kind of using Burke's speeches, his writings, in their arguments, both in support of Gladstone's proposals for home rule, but also against those proposals as well, particularly those who became known as liberal unionists, who saw Gladstone's proposals as being inconsistent with the liberal principles of civil and religious liberty. And to cut a long story short, the liberal unionists win Burke, and so Burke becomes a kind of proto-liberal unionist, and the liberal unionists kind of shortly align with the Conservatives, and they fuse fully into the Conservative Unionist Party in 1912. So a vital moment of the transformation of Burke into the founder of Conservatism, with a big and a small c, was in fact analysis done by liberals and a debate among liberals about liberal principles. In the case of Disraeli, new liberal and socialist historians of the Industrial Revolution were central in positioning Disraeli and other Tory factory reformers of the 1830s and 40s as the kind of the humanitarians who had opposed the nasty, inhumane political economists and laissez-faire Manchester liberalism. And here you can start to see that very famous kind of dualistic historical interpretation of the early 19th century, in which both a kind of what was termed Tory socialism and I guess what became classical liberalism were caricatured and mythologized at the same time as kind of two sides of the same coin. But while the Burke book stopped in the early 20th century, so kind of by 1914, Disraeli has brought me much closer to the present day. And I think it's here that I've been able to see the decline of a more kind of idealist, historicist mindset, which understands and uses the past creatively as a kind of emotive living force, and instead shifts, as historians like Josie Harris, Ben Jackson, Glory, and others have demonstrated, towards alternative understandings of human motivations rooted in self-interest, and from their politics and policy development. Conservatism in this context was increasingly and deliberately presented as non-ideological and simply a mindset. And the historian, again, primarily of modern Britain, Emily Robinson, has also argued that while history does still matter to contemporary politics, and that the legacies of previous administrations do continue to shape ideas about what is possible for governments to actually do, at least in the UK. Another product of this intellectual shift is what she calls a growing presentism, understood first in terms of an inability to engage with the past as a living force, rather than as something separate, the past. And second, an inability to conceive of a real imagined endpoint of future progress beyond kind of narratives of piecemeal social improvement. So history becomes more like a prop. In Truss cosplaying as Thatcher, or Rishi kind of giving these offhand references to her deflationary policies, aren't really equivalent to the kind of engagement that you see earlier in the century. Likewise, I think both the move away from talking about broader ideologies like conservatism, socialism, or liberalism, and the dearth of serious ideas to match the challenges of the present is reflected in, for example, the personalised singularity of modern isms common in political writing and commentary. So obviously Trumpism, but also in the UK, recent ones include Johnsonism, Starmerism, Farageism, to list just a few. So I guess what I'll end on is that if what I've learned is that isms are historically contingent, and we seem to have lost at least some of our ability to think historically, then we've also lost the ability to think with traditions or ideologies in the same way as those who invented them in the past. But to be positive, I think what I really love about our work and Julia's work and other people's work as well, and that's doing history in this kind of way, really shows how it takes all kinds of people to invent and reinvent isms or traditions or whatever term you want to use, academics, political actors, journalists, students, teachers. While on the one hand, I don't think there's anything eternal about conservatism or liberalism, on the one hand, there's also nothing inevitable about what might succeed them. So yeah, thank you for listening.
I have the worst job of following both of those acts. Yes to everything that my colleagues said. Thank you, Tom, for chairing, and Emily for getting us together. It's been so long for us talking about this, our work as it's been in progress. And there's a little bit of backstory here. I mean, obviously, Emily, your book was The Flag in the Sand. And, it's a huge just exemplar of how to do reception history for both Claire and myself. Claire is single-handedly responsible for saving me from a really bad dissertation idea when we were both at Stanford, which eventually became the book. And so I just couldn't be more honored to be in their presence talking about our books now. So, let me just open by saying, and maybe priming you to think about reception history for Adam Smith in particular. So who is Adam Smith? If I had to guess what's going on through your mind, although this is a very esteemed audience, right? Probably you're thinking about Adam Smith, the father of modern capitalism. Adam Smith, who wrote An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, right? Published in 1776, that really fateful year. And the man who gave us irreplaceable language for thinking about and talking about the economy, right? The invisible hand, this idea that people pursuing their own self-interest can promote the public good without intention or direction. And the notion that the invisible hand of the market, rather than the heavy hand of government, promotes freedom and flourishing in a modern society like ours has become not just the hallmark of a certain brand of conservative or libertarian economics today, but it's also just so naturalized in our everyday discourse about the economy that we often fail to appreciate the depth of that original insight and where it takes place in Smith's books and why he wrote The Wealth of Nations. So to kind of situate the puzzle that motivated my book on Smith's reception in America is that, trained as a political theorist and intellectual historian, it was very common to see these complaints among Smith scholars that poor old Adam Smith, right, this wide-ranging philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment, had basically just been whittled down into a trope, into a slogan for politicians, into a mascot for free market think tanks that's often associated with the political right. And that his reputation as an economist had overshadowed his more accurate characterization as a philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment, whose works spanned moral philosophy, jurisprudence, ballet, philosophy of science, and much more besides. He actually wrote a piece that talked about dance. Former dancer, I was very interested in that. It's like, oh, this is not the Adam Smith that most people know. So the motivation for the book, and I think likewise with Claire and Emily's, although I don't want to speak for themselves, is really to understand, like how, when, and why did a man like Smith gain such a narrow and often politically charged reputation? Right? Why did Smith become known primarily as an economist, and not just any economist, but a free market economist? And more broadly, why does reaching back for Smith's ideas time and time again, why is that so politically powerful? And so the approach, which I think resonates with Claire and Emily's approaches, was to reconstruct how and why people in the past read Smith and what meaning they made out of him. Not to judge those readings and to hold the line against anachronism, as so much of revisionist scholarship does, right? Like, that's not the right Smith, this is the right Smith. But to understand, given that that was the Smith that they encountered, they had a purpose for reading Smith in that time. Why was that so important? And what does that say about our present preoccupation when we're reaching for Smith today, too? So by way of kind of continuing this discussion, I'll give a brief arc of the book, and then I'll offer some reflections on what I've learned from writing the reception of Smith, and maybe a little bit more tailored to how we think about narratives about liberalism today. I'm a political theorist and kind of interloping historian at times. And so I'm really focused on kind of like the preoccupation that political theorists have had with kind of grand theories and histories of liberalism in the last decade or so. And then I thought I would close/open the discussion of, about this kind of more general question about what is it that we gain when we situate canonical thinkers like Burke, like Locke, like Smith, and their contested legacies in a much longer historical. So for the sake of simplicity, as well as provocation and fodder for discussion, I'm going to enlist what I call a 4 stages model that comes from Stefan Collini's book, Public Moralist, Political Thought and Intellectual Life in Britain. And I remember, Emily, you had mentioned this in a footnote, and I can't remember, Claire, you use this as well, but I think it's a really interesting schema by which we can think about processes of canonization. But as I'll mention, I think there's real deficits. So I think that it's an interesting way to think about reception. So to be clear, my book doesn't do this explicitly. I'm kind of using this as an exercise, and then we can talk more about it. So stage 1, right? The author and the text are seen as living resources. So when we situate Smith's 2 major published texts, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, we're situating them in the context of the American founding era. And we can see how Smith's ideas were broadly useful for thinking about everything from practical virtue, the cultivation of critical, moral, and intellectual faculties, and even things like very technical analysis about banking and public credit. And Smith's reliance on observations from ordinary life, the deep analysis of history to distill general principles, resonated with this more general Enlightenment sensibility in how we understand man and society using reason and history. And one thing that's notable about the way in which Smith's readers in the late 18th century are engaging with him is that they aren't appealing to him as Adam Smith, the father of economics. They're consulting him as just another technical expert. Right? He's one resource out of many that they find to resonate with their enlightened way of seeing the world. So the title of the chapter that I wrote that focuses on the founding era is called The Best Book Extant, because that's more or less how people encountered Smith. Right? He's a really good book. So stage 2, discipleship. By the 1820s, Americans began treating political economy as more than a branch of statecraft. And the Wealth of Nations gets designated as the agreed upon origin point of the science of political economy. It's not just for the Alexander Hamiltons and the James Madisons of the world to consult when they're designing the literal institutions of a fledgling nation. It's an entire field of knowledge production. So professors, textbook writers, educators endow Smith with an authoritative status as they're looking to a variety of intellectual sources, mostly from Great Britain and France, and they're critically engaging with these sources to reconfigure them for American circumstances and American educational needs. So we have new tracts, new treatises, and textbooks that are compared to the Wealth of Nations, not just in terms of whether the author agrees with Smith's positions, but also in terms of their style, their composition, and their organization. So Smith's reputation, as one reviewer put it in the North American Review, was sustained, quote, not through the blindness and indifference of those who followed him, but with, quote, the care and acumen which succeeding writers have bestowed on the wealth of nations through critical engagement. But discipleship is hardly ever politically neutral. Debates over free trade throughout the 19th century transformed the terms on which Americans engaged with Smith and his ideas. The wealth of nations became a tool that gave free trade scientific legitimacy and intellectual heft. But it was also used by protectionists and proponents of the so-called American system to delegitimize political economy as a useful science that was trans-historical and universal. Even after the Civil War, debates over American trade policy intensified, turning Smith into little more than a partisan mascot for free trade and the wealth of nations into the manifesto of laissez-faire economics. So invoking Smith's intellectual authority in the context of persistent debates about trade thus became an explicitly political statement. Now this gets us to stage 3, authority. By the last quarter of the 19th century, Smith can be said to have become an authority because what mattered less at this point was the substance of his ideas and more the fact that he became a symbol absorbed into a tradition in more general cultural terms. And there are Smith centenary celebrations in both England and the United States. There was a very famous dinner banquet at Delmonico's, which was a fancy French restaurant in New York City, where there were gatherings of these free trade partisans and everybody's toasting to the wealth of nations. Crucially, Smith's authority is available to proponents and opponents alike. He's still celebrated and toasted as the apostle of free trade, but he's also someone who protectionists said even Smith, the father of free trade, would admit that diminishing production of manufacturers would impact the home market, the most important of all. Right? So his authority is available to opponents and proponents alike. And this speaks to a point that Collini makes, right? That Smith had achieved such a status that it was in everybody's interest, no matter their political allegiance, to attempt to appropriate him, even if it's merely to signal where they stand in relation to him. Now, this moment in Smith's American reception in the late 19th century is interesting because Smith's reputation is actually very unstable. On the one hand, Smith's reputation as the apostle of free trade loomed large in politics. In the academy, though, a new generation of economists were challenging the political and methodological orthodoxy of their discipline by challenging Smith's reputation as a laissez-faire dogmatist. And in their engagements with both Smith's moral philosophy and his political economy, as well as the link among his works and the newly discovered lectures on jurisprudence, there's a kind of bibliographic discovery at the same time, these economists are projecting arguments about the correct socio and ethical orientation of their discipline of economics back onto Smith. And in the writings of these new generation economists, Smith symbolized, kind of middle path between the extremisms of laissez-faire capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other. But the complexity and pluralism of this moment in Smith's reception gets overshadowed by one of the most famous, now infamous, instantiations of Smith as authority. And that is, of course, the invention of the so-called Chicago School of Smith. In the wake of the Great Depression, Chicago economists over different generations turned to Adam Smith to construct the content of a new liberal, now often seen as a neoliberal creed, and to defend their methodological approach to positive economics. But they did so in ways that ultimately diminished, if not excluded, other interpretations of Smith's ideas. The version of Adam Smith associated with the likes of economists like George Stigler and Milton Friedman, right? This is a Smith who stood for the methodological primacy of rational self-interest as the sole motive for human behavior, universal explanatory power, and for markets and enshrining economic and political freedom. Right? That Smith is so recognizable today that we often forget that it was the invention or the creation of a particular group of people at a particular time with a specific purpose in mind. Okay, so this brings us to the fourth stage in István Collini's model, right? Canonization. With reference to Collini's model, this is when the author, quote, ostensibly has no current political resonance, ostensibly being the key word there, but is recognized as having some kind of classic status or to have become an object of purely scholarly inquiry. Now, I find this to be the most puzzling and problematic of colonial stages. On the one hand, it captures the fact that so much of revisionist scholarship for Smith, at least since the 1970s, has been precisely to hold the line against anachronism, right, to reclaim Smith from the Chicago interpretation. And there's no question that Smith, both in academic and in public discourse, has the status of a classic thinker, but that he is and has been an object of scholarly inquiry in no way precludes the political resonance or practical import of invoking Smith time and time again. Right? In fact, I would argue that it's precisely because Smith has so much political resonance that scholars are so eager to engage with his works in the first place. One theme in the scholarship around Smith of the last 2 decades or so that I think really stands out and is of particular relevance for this panel is the way in which Smith has been reoriented within histories and political theories of liberalism. As Duncan Bell once commented, scholarship since the kind of mid-2010s has turned liberalism into a, quote, hyperinflated, multifaceted, and deep reservoir full of ideological contradictions. Grand narratives of liberalism's inherent contradictions, its so-called lost moral commitments, its post-war ascendancy or preordained failures have become a mainstay among historians of political thought for quite some time. And my reading of this trend is that Smith had to be, on the one hand, disentangled from his neoliberal Chicago captors, but nevertheless re-embedded in an alternative liberal tradition. So, for example, we have a book like Jennifer Pitz's 2006 A Turn to Empire, which places Smith at the beginning of a liberal tradition that was critical of empire, alongside Jeremy Bentham, Benjamin Constant, and, surprise, Edmund Burke. And meanwhile, we have Amartya Sen, Catherine István, treating Smith as a liberal cosmopolitan, emphasizing the way in which Smith's idea of the impartial spectator could be used as a device for theorizing justice on a global scale, emphasizing a capabilitarian approach to basic needs and human freedom. And to just name a few other liberalisms that have been coined with reference to Smith: sympathetic liberalism, liberal pluralism, reform liberalism, liberal egalitarianism, pragmatic liberalism, liberal rationalism, the list goes on. There's a Smith for everyone. Now, I've written elsewhere that I think there's a cynical interpretation of this trend, right, which is that scholars doing what scholars do best simply retroject their concepts and categories back onto Smith to defend their own preferred vision of liberalism. Now, I think we can accept that and then move on and say something slightly more charitable and nuanced, which is that one of the starting points for so much scholarship is a shared assumption that Smith can offer a corrective to a whole host of deficiencies in contemporary liberalism and liberal political thought. So where liberal rationalism might fail to account for other regarding motives, we look to Smith's liberalism to take into account affect, spectatorship, passions, and sentiments, so that we can explain the motives of justice and also see a way to rectify injustice. Where others might see a deficiency of liberalism in its narrow focus on the use of state power in relation to individual freedom, a Smithian so-called liberalism focuses on the positive forms of associational life in the market, while also articulating fears of domination by both private and public actors. Nor is this kind of fascination and obsession with using Smith to correct deficiencies of modern liberalism new. One of the last moments that I examine in the book is the neoconservative pushback of the neoliberal reading of Smith in the 1970s and 1980s. Thinkers like Irving Kristol and Gertrude Himmelfarb offered a reading of Smith's moral philosophy that they believed preserved individual moral agency and elevated traditional moral institutions that would be a corrective to the soullessness of liberal capitalist society. So again, we could chalk this up to scholarly fads and the tendency to just want to see the Smith that we like, but I think it's more interesting and in fact productive to pay attention how the proliferation of Smithian liberalism, the variety of Smithian liberalisms, can track the evolving language we use to articulate our hopes and our fears about liberalism today. Okay, so I've said a little bit about how this longer view of reception can help us make sense of debates about liberalism. I'll just conclude with maybe some more open-ended thoughts on how reception history might actually teach us some something about the figure himself, in my case, Smith. I don't know about Emily and Claire, but like the question I get after every single book talk I've given is like, okay, well, what is your version of Smith? Like, give us a version of Smith. And I'm like, dude, that's not what the book is about. But okay, I'll try. In anticipation of that question. So, plenty of canonical thinkers get narrowed, politically appropriated, used, and abused, right? This is Exhibit A. And though reception history tells us that the meaning and significance and the endurance of a text is made by the audience, made by the reader, surely there's something about Smith that makes them so special. Surely there's something about Locke or Burke, right, that makes them susceptible or so rich for that kind of reception. Otherwise, why would we keep holding these texts up as classics? Right? So the short answer, in my view, is that Smith is so susceptible to flattening, one-sidedness, political appropriation because he's so complex. That seems like a kind of flat answer, so I'm going to elaborate a little bit more. One of my favorite descriptions of Smith is from Donald Winch, who said, Smith is infuriatingly balanced. In other words, just when you think that you can shoehorn Smith into a box, or you can assign an ism to him, just when you think you've trapped your liberal, your conservative, progressive, or whatever, Smith will start making the case for something that defies that logic. And I think Smith was a thinker who was genuinely ambivalent about the progress that market relations were initiating, which is why the works look the way they do. Right? He saw market relations as both a source of liberation and also oppression. He understood how the division of labor could be both an engine of productivity and wealth generation, but also the source of intellectual and moral alienation. He saw how wealth could be a new source of power, one that eroded feudal domination, but also entrenched new forms of exploitation through corporate power and state capture, right? And so I think it's this both and quality of Smith that we're not as comfortable with today because we so want to see consistency, we so want to see unity. And Smith doesn't give us that. And so we choose the Smith that we want. And that's why I think it's so delightful, because it's so rare to encounter a thinker who is many-sided, thoughtful, ambivalent, and kind of flies in the face of these categories that we are so apt to read back on the thinkers like that. And I think that's why he's captivated readers for so long and continue to captivate readers as we move forward. So I will stop there and open up for questions.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you for an incredibly rich set of reflections. Maybe while everyone is thinking about their questions, is there anything in anything anyone has said that one of you would like to respond to?
So I think one of the things that stands out to me, thinking about this is the point that Glory ended on, is what unites Locke and Burke and Smith is, on a fundamental level, their complexity and the fact that they just were so many different things, and that the process of turning them into conservatives or liberals or whatever it may be is a process of sort of narrowing and of trying to make something consistent that is not consistent. And I think that we see this, and just speaking of Locke in particular, sort of Locke's inconsistencies, and sort of attention to inconsistency in his philosophy is actually one of the things that makes him so ripe for like perpetual reinvention. And I think that's one of the things, though, that also makes it, I'm curious to hear Emily and Glory's thoughts on this too, that makes then the experience of teaching this work to our students so sort of invigorating and illuminating, because they assume, I'm thinking of sort of a typical 18-year-old, that, oh, there was Burke, there was Locke, there was Smith. And they sort of always were these people. And they were born that way and they died that way. And, oh, I'm not yet Locke, so I'm doomed, or I'm not yet, and you look at someone like Locke, and this is, I think, what his 20th century biographer does such a nice job of covering. I mean, Locke changes really, really dramatically over the course of his life. Like Locke of the 1660s is significantly more sort of pro-authoritarian, political, religiously than the sort of Locke of the 1690s, whatever beyond. And there isn't a single Locke, and he's not this static, stable figure. And I think that that's something that, actually unites, Burke's the same, and Smith's the same. And then this, but really foregrounding the transformation as being one of trying to make a thinker consistent when the thinker in his own life and work is not in fact consistent. We should be celebrating that or calling attention to it. But it's also really difficult because we're so also drawn to turning thinkers into adjectives that mean a single thing. So Burkean, Lockean, Smithy.
Yeah. Yeah. If I can just extend that, I mean, in the Smith example, one of the kind of pivotal moments in Smith scholarship and historiography is the invention of Das Adam-Smith problem in the late 19th century, because of course it comes from Germany, right? This interpretive problem that says, how could Smith have written a book where the primary motive of human interaction is sympathy, and then the next book is about self-interest? These couldn't have been written by the same thinker. Smith changed his mind, right? Oh God, there's an inconsistency. And
how could somebody have supported America and not France?
Right. And so, you know, it's funny when we read back and we see the emergence of these so-called problems, which now scholars are like, there's no Adam Smith problem. But we create new problems for ourselves. So that the new version of the Adam Smith problem is not that there's somehow a philosophical incompatibility or that Smith changed his mind, but actually, I would say, maybe I'm in the minority here. I know I'm definitely in the minority of Smith scholars. An overinterpretation because we have to have a need for consistency. So the theory of moral sentiments must be the moral blueprint for commercial society, right? That Smith not only anticipated the need for kind of a moral defense of capitalism in The Wealth of Nations, but that in fact, after he had written The Wealth of Nations, he went back to revise the theory of moral sentiments to update his views and saw the kind of potential for wealth to have these corrosive effects. And my somewhat spicy take on that is like, actually the theory of moral sentiments is responding to a very different question than The Wealth of Nations, and it's okay to have written 2 books on 2 different topics. And there's certainly methodological unity. Smith still has this kind of empirical, deeply historical sensibility, but the kind of need to make everything connect, I think, is a peculiar feature of that kind of a peculiar feature of kind of need for consistency that gets right back onto these thinkers rather than letting them be complex, rather than letting them have, you know, letting them change their mind, letting them write 2 different books.
Yeah, I would pick up on the teaching point. I hate teaching this topic because if any student has done A-level government and politics over here in sixth form of college, they have literally been drilled into them that there are these political ideologies of liberalism and conservatism and socialism. So I teach on a second year intellectual history course that is predominantly kind of goes from kind of French Revolution to the early 20th century, and it's really, really hard to reconstruct. In a way, it demonstrates the success of what we demonstrate in our books, that those things are they're kind of, they still exist in textbooks and in like syllabuses and things like that today, whether or not they actually mean anything to anybody. But it's really hard to get students to debunk those things. And I think that the majority of essays, like what I was talking about before in terms of my citations, will say, well, you know, Burke wasn't the founder of conservatism, full stop. But Burke, the first conservative. So kind of like, and I think that every now and again, like this year, there was like one student who got it, and he wrote this like great essay, like, yeah. But it's like, it's kind of, I think in a way, I think what our work has shown is actually the success of particular reinterpretations that we are still living with. and that it is hot, and some of them are been so firmly established. It's actually really hard to to kind of reconstruct people's ideas about who the fathers of, it's always daddies, isn't it? Who the fathers of these things are, and and I think sometimes I find it quite difficult to teach this because it's I just those some of these traditions and these ideologies, they're so ingrained, but yeah, we march on.
Should have a discussion on teaching our
Right. Any questions from the audience for yes.
Thank you to all three of you. I've so enjoyed this. I'm going to try and think how to phrase this question because it's still forming. Obviously, one of the themes we've spoken to is these complex figures being eventually received in a narrow way. But we've talked about Kalini, but I guess my question is, are there times and places where writ large it is easier or harder for any political theorist or philosopher to be received in a normal way versus a complex, where other, again, times and places that lend themselves to an intellectual narrowness of reception versus a complex?
So this doesn't speak directly to the question, but I think it's interesting. One way to think about it is how people are encountering these thinkers. And here I'm thinking, we'll move away at some point, how students and readers are encountering them. So if you're encountering Smith and you're reading Wealth of Nations, you're encountering Locke, you're reading the Second Treatise, the way that we do this in the 21st century, 20th century, is in like standalone volumes. And one of the things that I was really interested in thinking about sort of understanding Locke's impact on the past is how Americans were actually like coming face to face with Locke. So how were they actually like the experience of reading Locke, meaning that when an American in the 18th century read the Second Treatise or read Locke on the reasonableness of Christianity or read Locke's rules for the creation of a sort of society, they weren't doing so in like single volume text. And this seems like a small point, but I think it's actually an important one. They're encountering it in a multi-volume work where they're literally flipping past biographical sketches of the author, of the thinker, and then they're viewing the work that they're reading alongside essentially everything else that he's read, because they're reading him in the standard 3-volume or whatever sort of volume text it is. And so this doesn't answer your question in terms of a specific moment, in time when sort of that kind of expansive interpretation would have been more accessible. But I think what it does is it shows us that there were times when the ways in which people actually like physically encountered the material lent themselves much more to a much sort of wider ranging understanding of the thinker, simply because they had to read everything else, or they had to flip past it to get to whatever text they were interested in.
It's a super, super interesting and important question, and the political scientist to me that I often have to suppress is thinking like, what's generalizable, right, about moments of expansive, complicated interpretation. And the historian is like, it's always historically contingent, right? But what I will say is that, like, for Smith, the moment of the founding era, and I would say pre-industrialization, enables Smith to be accessed in a multiplicity of ways because the structure of the economy hasn't been foreclosed, right? The structure of the American political economy has not yet been decided. And so, especially in the trade debates like the 1820s and 1830s, these congressmen are giving some really long speeches, and they're like, I'm reading all of Smith and all of Ricardo, and I still can't make up my mind because the structure of the US economy isn't unified. And they're like, I can't figure out whether trade is good or a bad thing. And so the debates go on forever and ever because they themselves haven't figured it out. So the possibility for reading Smith in a narrow way hasn't been foreclosed yet. And I think what forecloses that is post-industrialization and also like post-disciplinary professionalization and methodological commitment. So like the Chicago School is a really good example of that, because these guys are so committed to price theory, to doing it their way, to the predictive power of economics and rationality, that those are the things that put the blinders on, right? So they access Smith with those kind of prefabricated commitments. Even if, right, the possibility for kind of a more liberal market economy is still up in the air, I would say it's the ideology of methodology that has been much more entrenched. That wasn't the case in the kind of like 1840s, 1850s, and even 1880s, when you have this kind of like methodological debates within the field.
Yeah, I think that the development of university disciplines is extremely significant.
Yeah.
Particularly, I think generally the creation of English literature is so important for the history of political thought. But I also think, like, from the Burke perspective, I think if you think about like the broader kind of late 19th century, early 20th century, you have a whole host of thinkers who are, you know, very interested in historicism, organicism, idealism, who see in Burke a kind of key precursor, someone who moved away from social contract theory, who could be reframed as exactly this type of kind of like the kind of someone who you could go back to as that type of thinker. But that wasn't necessarily something that was just done by conservatives or whatever. It was done by a whole host of people from across the political spectrum. So there was a kind of, you know, there was a kind of broader kind of intellectual trends and contexts that were not limited just to particular political groupings or ideologies or traditions or whatever. So became very interested in Burke. But it was through that process that you have certain liberal idealists, for example, who saw in Burke someone who, you know, provided a kind of basis for thinking about the organic whole and things like that. But eventually decided that Burke wasn't organic enough. You know, because he wasn't a Democrat or whatever. And that's kind of how some of those liberal thinkers again helped to create Burke as a small c conservative thinker, because although they saw him as providing relevance and, you know, a kind of important precedent for them, he wasn't enough for them to kind of keep thinking through to like their goals and aims that they had. So again, kind of, you know, certain types of liberal thinkers again helped to push Burke into a particular mold, because he was a lot for them, but he wasn't enough.
No, I was just very interested in the question, and indeed I suspect that the number of possible answers is very long. I mean, I suppose on the face of it, there's no obvious macro answer. It's just, you know, do we live in a good time or a bad time? Although, having said that, in fact, having grown up, sorry, this is a very, very long time ago, in the sort of 70s and 80s, what you were witnessing there in this country, at least, was, for want of a better word, the decadence of an exceptionally confident and unified culture. And in fact, that culture was very open-minded because, paradoxically, it was so confident. In other words, in a world where the people still, particularly in the elites and above all in the academy, had come through a system whereby there was a known social hierarchy which everybody accepted, and there were certain sorts of intellectual agenda. I mean, in the case of history, British history was still central, or even English history, but you could afford to be within those limits, very important limits, of course. You could afford to be all open-minded. But my second answer is more of a micro answer. This is what Emily was saying, which I do think is very important, is that with the best of them in the world, your best hope of being open-minded is probably in the academy. And there's still something wonderful, whether or not it's appreciated. I believe it is appreciated, actually, particularly retrospectively. There is something wonderful about student existence where, say for the BA, there are 3 years where, I won't say you can say exactly what you like, but in a pedagogic context, you can say, well, basically, any idea that comes to your head is, as long as you think that probably there's at least some respectability about it, with luck, that there's some evidence for it or something. And I suspect, again, I'm particularly struck by, again, what Emily was saying, with which, alas, I entirely agree, that you can't be school class. It's so badly educated. That the academy is your last best hope. Whether the academy is open-minded is again is obviously a very contestable question as well. Sorry.
Grace.
Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed your talks, and I wonder, kind of picking up on that, if we could have a little meta exercise. What is it you all represent a little sort of moment in a way, or this sort of represents a little moment of all of you doing this reception history. What is it about your training and your intellectual histories that has brought you to this reception moment? Why do we need to do this now, and why did you need to do this exercise of looking at these people? I'm thinking about methodologies in intellectual history also, which might have brought you to this approach.
It's weird, isn't it? Because there are other people in this room who do this too, and we're all kind of the same age. We're all women. PC, you can be an honorary woman. But I did it first. So for my own part, I can trace it very directly to the second year intellectual history course that I now teach on, which I took as an undergraduate at Manchester. And it was then very, it was conceived at, the course was called European Intellectual History from Rousseau to Freud. And each week you did a theme and you read, I think, so week 3 or 4 or whatever it was Conservatism, and we read Burke. And by that point, I'd done enough weeks to have we read Rousseau and School of People, and then we read Burke. And it was at that point that I had bright pink hair at this point, like I know what I mean, like this was very unexpected. But I remember I can literally remember being sat on the library floor in Blue 3 because the Burke books were all very low down. So I remember like pulling them out and just being sat on the floor and kind of like flicking through them. And then when I read them for the seminar, I remember thinking that the books were weird in comparison to the Rousseau. They just felt a lot more polemical. They didn't feel the same. And I ended up doing my essay on Burke, and this was like, it was like to say it to other Manchester students at the time was like, but luckily I had my pink hair to protect me. And then the next year for my third year dissertation, I was like, oh, maybe I could do something on, how Burke was received or something like that. And I found this article by Isaac Bramlett, I think, about Edmund Burke and the Liberals or something. And at that point, I decided that I wanted to do a master's. So and at that point, you always had to apply with a research project to do a master's, which you don't have to do everywhere now. But I decided that I was going to do that for my master's and kind of keep it. But it really was quite a kind of, I mean, maybe we all have the same moments at the same time, but it really was just from kind of that moment of thinking that the Burke scholarship seems strange, and how the way that conservatism was framed just seemed so loose and woolly. I remember being sat in the lecture theatre thinking, like, how many people in this lecture theatre would actually support radical revolution? Do you know what I mean? Like, how much, like, presumably most people would be like no one else has pink hair, like who like, surely most people would actually support organic change and gradual reform and all these things we were being told what Burkean conservatism was. So it really just like spawned from my own strange thoughts, like but I don't know. Yeah, you said that Claire got you onto this,
Claire,
so
you go first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Grace, what strikes me about your question, right, is it's a deeply personal. How does any no, but in the sense, right? How does any?
But it is odd how we all.
You know what?
Yeah.
I was also thinking about your the intellectual history and what you were reading in intellectual history and methodology, and I was thinking about Fenton Skinner a little bit, and I was thinking about all of the people that you may have been reading who may have led you down a reception kind of path.
I mean, I didn't start reading, so I think my experience was a little bit different in that I became interested in Locke specifically just by accident. I was a classicist at the time and had gone to graduate school specifically to work with the foremost scholar of classical reception in the United States. And I thought I was going to write about Plato and Aristotle and the founding fathers or whatever. And then decided just to sort of turn my attention to Locke because I had done enough political theory and I knew he was really important. And there seemed like there was this gap. And I thought I understood the 18th century Locke, who he was for Jefferson, etc., who he was in the 20th century for the historians I was reading. And I wanted to know who he was in the 19th century. And I started, as I think a lot of graduate students do, looking at basic publication history, and was quite surprised at the time to discover that Locke's two treatises weren't published in the United States for all of the 19th century, between 1773 and the early 20th century. And that presented a kind of puzzle that then I set out to answer. And I thought it was going to be a short seminar paper. And it turned out to be not a very short project at all.
An award-winning book.
But I think, but I think to your question, and it is striking just the sort of what brings you to ask different questions about the past. And so then also for me, it was thinking, and I think Emily articulated this point well in your discussion of sources and just expanding what sources we turn to. So for me, right, there's this vast literature on, we'll say, Locke in the 18th century. If you look at the sources that people are reading from the 18th century, it's quite narrow, maybe sermons, maybe political tracts. And for me, I was interested in how people were thinking about rearing children, right? And what someone who wasn't getting a college education, who wasn't a sort of relatively elite white man, what, she may have been reading. And so I think that sort of attention to thinking more expansively about the ways in which the source bases that we use also just reveal different stories and different histories, I think was definitely a central sort of piece of that. And then I think also being in a moment where, right, we're following into sort of, I don't know, to a certain extent, the traditions established, half century prior, but also doing work alongside other people who are doing sort of asking similar questions, I think is just an exciting and sort of, yeah, we'll say it's intellectually stimulating place to be.
So I guess I have like partly autobiographical, partly intellectual answer. The autobiographical part is funny enough, like Claire, I started my doctoral degree with a classics degree and an intellectual history degree under me. I did the MPhil at Cambridge, had no idea what I was doing. It was a pretty traumatizing experience, to be quite honest. And then thought I was going to start training under a classicist in a political science department in the United States, writing about the kind of like sort of reception, but really political theory of ancient and modern democracy. I didn't know it at the time that was called reception, but I was really interested in kind of where our ideas about inequality and democracy come from and why we think about inequality as a problem. What kind of problem is inequality in a democracy? So that was the initial proposal for the dissertation. American intellectual history of inequality. Totally unachievable, absolutely bonkers, would not recommend. Enter Claire, right? A couple years ahead of me. We shared a couple dissertation advisors, but in different departments. So Claire was doing ancient history. I was in political science as a political theorist. And Claire had circulated a paper that was a chapter of her dissertation on Locke. And afterward, I was like, oh my God, I've been wondering the same thing about Smith. Like, why did he become known as an economist, not a moral philosopher? Like, when did, I think you were circulating this like pivotal chapter about kind of like when did we get Locke the liberal rather than Locke the educator? And I think Claire and Carolyn both came up to me afterward and they were like, you should write on that. And I was like, oh, okay. So that was like the conversion story where I finally understood like what's the difference between a topic, right? Inequality and a research question. Given that I'm interested in ideas about inequality, given that Adam Smith features so prominently in the way ideologies are structured and the way kind of intellectual traditions are structured, why did he become known as kind of representative of a certain view towards the natural, like inequality as being natural rather than this other set of things? The other coincidence, and this is the kind of intellectual answer, is that at the time there was this like efflorescence of Smith scholarship on Smith's ideas about inequality. And I was really, really drawn to that because the kind of production of that cottage industry of Smith scholarship was that Smith was this moral critic of capitalism. He cared about the kind of sympathetic impact that economic inequality had on our moral sentiments. And I was like, oh, this is interesting, but also a little weird, right? Like, why is there this fight about Smith and what he stands for? And why are there so many different Smiths? And Carolyn, our advisor, Carolyn Winter, told me once in a meeting, which stuck with me, and she said, find the fight, because where there's a fight, there's a really interesting research question. So I would say that, like, for me, I was lucky that I had a predecessor to help me, again, like rescue me from a bad idea and to help me define a research question, but also the time in which I was asking these questions, which just, came from like my own personal interest in ideas about inequality, happened to align with a really interesting moment in Smith scholarship that kind of fueled how I went about approaching that question.
Can I just add one final thing? I think also just what's interesting is that you might have had lots of contextualist readings of thinkers debunking myths and things like that, like the Disraeli myth was very much debunked by historians in the 60s and the 70s, but generally those historians, particularly just speaking from the Disraeli perspective, because that's what's been in my head, have generally been less interested in the question of how the myth came to be, because they assumed that you would know. And I think that that's less the case now. I'm not Robert Blake in 1966. So I think it's not just a question about myths have been debunked, thinkers have been recontextualized, but actually this is kind of telling a different story, which is about how the myths came to be in the first place. So it's telling a different kind of story that connects some of those previous histories as well, I think.
Right. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had a couple of questions and they made observations which have a sort of a link. And they come from things that Emily said and then that Glory said. The first is when you began, you said people think I'm a historian of the Conservative Party, as opposed to a historian of conservatism or conservative thought. And it that made me think, because there's this one tendency, which is to think of the Conservative Party, describing itself as the stupid party, and not being interested in that those sort of things. And in Trollope in the 1860s and 1870s, the parliamentary Conservative Party are scandalous opportunists and nothing much else. And yet, if you want to go to Trollope and find a statement of sort of Burkean conservative principles, it's going to be the Duke of Omnium, who is a Whig, in the Prime Minister, written by a man, Trollope himself, who stood for the Liberal Party. I was absolutely shocked to discover that in a way when I first found that out. So that was one moment where I thought parties don't really matter, actually. These are moments. So the way you set up that distinction was very, very helpful for me. But also, there are these moments in the history of the Conservative Party where spasmic moments where they decide that they really do want to be intellectually serious. And Peter was talking about the 1970s and 1980s. And that was a point in British politics where there was a considerable efflorescence of different sort of things like the Conservative Philosophy Group, the Salisbury Review, all sorts of different people trying to create an intellectual basis for a modern conservatism of different sorts. Now, and one of those was the Adam Smith Institute. And this is where I was reminded by what you said about the recognition of Smith as a potential critic of empire as well. Because at that point, it seems to me in British history, what I know is much younger than Peter, what I associated the Adam Smith Institute with was creating an intellectual basis for an economic policy that was profoundly heartless towards the post-industrial communities that were being undermined by the Thatcher government, destroyed by the Thatcher government. And at the same time, this is somebody who, as a ruler, who was willing to do almost nothing to, say, take on apartheid in South Africa and some of the great evils of the time. So it was a real surprise for me when I read then, I think it's William's book on the history of the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in particular, the real importance of Smith for the attack on the West Indian interest and the use of different sorts of protectionist policies in order to support the sugar trade and the British slave trade. And that it was that bit of Smith that struck me as so massively different politically in terms of what use was being made from what he was representing from what I was used to in terms of how he had been appropriated by thinkers in the 70s and 80s. So I got what you were saying, I think, in that respect, and I'd love to read your book. I've enjoyed all the talks enormously. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, just the observation that there is just this massive gap between what Smith actually said and what he represented in his time and what he gets whittled down to represent in these kind of think tanky spheres. So the American counterpart in the US, I mean, besides like American Enterprise Institute and Cato Institute, which I mean, have so many headlines and articles and scholarships, the Adam Smith blah, 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 right? Adam Smith would be appalled at what Donald Trump is doing right now. Is if anybody cares about what Adam Smith thought, they're just like freaking out in general. But also, to your point more generally, that like there's a profound irony that many of these think tank scholarship centers are very pro big business lobbying of the federal government in order to structure the policy space to promote free markets, which is exactly the phenomenon that Smith was critiquing at the time, right? The kind of like elite business capture of state mechanisms to promote markets in their favor. And yet they put it under the gloss of Adam Smith stood for free markets and prosperity. Kind of not thinking about what Smith actually said. I'll just
Yeah.
That yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the very interesting talks. I was just wondering, in terms of the practice of receptive history, how do you decide the timescales that you're using? Because they're quite broad and ambitious. I'm wondering how practically are you able to sort of accomplish things on that sort of scale?
Lots of reading. Yeah, well, I mean, I think for Burke, it was kind of like, well, there was no point starting before kind of like 1830 because there'd already been an article by James Sack that had kind of looked at that period and kind of detailed how he was considered highly problematic by lots of conservatives because of his the trial against Warren Hastings, his potential connections to Catholicism, and his status as a Whig, and so and there were kind of broad issues around kind of consistency and things like that. So I kind of started in 1830, and then I think, I don't know, I didn't write the chapters in order. So it was kind of more that like I kind of started with chapter 1, which was on how Burke was used in constitutional politics and as a source for kind of parliamentary government in the period. But I also started by looking at the major biographies. So one of the first major biography, because Burke never had an official biographer, so that was kind of one of the main issues, is that the people that were supposed to write the official biography never did. So there's a biography that comes out in sort of, I think, 1819 by an Irishman. There's another major biography that comes out, I think, in the 1860s. And then there was John Morley's in 1870. There was two. There was one in 69 and one in 74 too. Anyway, that's testing me. But essentially, looking at the major biographies showed you already some of the major changes that kind of took place over the space of about kind of like 60 or so years. And then by 1913, you had books that were called things like The Political Philosophy of Burke. So even just by looking at texts that were like major biographies had Burke in the name, you could kind of start to see changes in reputation and interpretation. And then, I don't know, the final chapter on education was actually like a total fluke. So I was in the Bodleian with my friend James, who was also supervised by Peter, and he was working on historiography, and he'd got out a University of Manchester calendar from 1886, and I was like, ooh. So I picked it up and was flicking through it, and it had all of the examinations from that year in them, and in one of the history exams, and it was obviously 1886, so home year, there was a question about Burke, and I was like, oh my god, this is I need to read more of these. So I ordered up like as many, like hundreds and hundreds. I was baying to the librarians, and then I looked at different universities and things like that, and kind of realised how circulation, and particularly in education and the development of university courses and things like that, really was an essential component in canonization and circulation, and how these traditions not only get kind of established academically and used by politicians and scholars and whoever, but are actually taught through to kind of generations of students, because you can find things like model answer books, and so you can see what the students are expected to be. So yeah, it's like you sort of feel your way through. But I always think that starting with biographies and like the books that have the names in the title are a kind of good way to kind of, if you're looking at a particular thinker anyway, are sometimes a good way to try to see big changes in interpretation, just as a kind of pilot project.
So I build on that question for Claire and Glory, and maybe get you to reflect on like the American Republic as a kind of time zone itself, for this kind of reception history, because it's and I guess the kind of challenges and opportunities it creates of taking a multi-century national framework as the zone of the historical project.
Saying the United States in the 18th century isn't the United States in the 21st century.
Well, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and I think it's something that there are. So the payoffs, I think, are significant in casting a sort of wide chronological net. That's not the right metaphor. In that you can see change over time, right? The downside, of course, is that you have to deal with the levels, the sort of the significant differences. I mean, too many to list now between the 18th century and the 21st century. And when you're telling a story of change over time, it's not very interesting if the story of change over time is because you're looking at certain people or certain questions or certain themes in the 18th century, and then you're just looking at a whole different set in the 20th century or 21st century. Is that really change over time? Or is your focus as a historian just shifting? And so for me, one of the ways that, and this is where I like sort of biographical approach, there's a kind of source-based consistency there. For me, my question was always, my goal wasn't to sort of uncover every instance of Locke's use over the last 300 years.
That would be a boring.
Yeah, and nor will I ever do that. But my sort of guiding principle was sort of who Locke was for as wide a group of people as possible. That changes, right? But the idea isn't just Locke in the academy or Locke for professional political theorists, but as sort of wide and ordinary. If you were to sort of ask, if you were to time travel and ask just, we'll say decently educated American on the streets of Philadelphia in 1760, 1860, 1960, sort of who is John Locke, and having that sort of tried to bring some consistency to the sort of frame and the level of focus, I thought was a useful approach. That also meant, though, that there were moments and debates and sort of episodes of engagement with Locke that I just ignored in my book. I don't talk about sort of debates over like gold and silver in the late 19th century and sort of what Congress is doing with like a couple of mentions of Locke in the 1870s. Like, that's interesting. Someone could write a great article on that, but that didn't answer that wasn't sort of didn't fit under the umbrella of, okay, so to the sort of most Americans as possible, sort of who is Locke, why does he matter? So it just got left out. So I think part of this decision, and I think maybe we all felt that in taking such broad sort of chronological scopes, is you end up actually having to like exclude a lot and not just include as much as possible. And the process of deciding both what you're not going to talk about and what you are going to talk about become sort of equally important.
Yeah. So
to answer your
just to add to that. So I say exactly the same thing at the beginning of my book. It's not about everything that everybody said about Burke. It's about like how Burke became seen as the founder of modern conservatism, and in a British context, for example, his aesthetic treatise, Sublime and Beautiful, isn't important in any way whatsoever. There obviously were discussions going on about that in Britain, but it didn't really matter at all in terms of this story. But if you looked at his German reception, it really does matter a lot more. So because in Germany they had Sublime and Beautiful and they had Reflections, and they didn't have to deal with all of the weird British stuff about Whiggism and the other writings and things like that. So so some texts matter in different contexts more because of availability of material and things like that, as well as just different interests and things like that.
To answer your question, is it practical? No.
No.
Are there ways to make it practical? Yes, and I think that's what you're hearing from us, which is that you have to make choices about how you're going to cover a massive sweep of time, and justify those choices. For some perspective, the dissertation version of this, it was like there was an 18th century chapter, there was a 19th century chapter, there was a Chicago School chapter in the 20th century with an introduction and conclusion that just fizzled up. The final book had 7 substantive chapters, one of which I had to write completely from scratch after the first set of reviews came in, because they were like, well, you can't just end with Chicago. You need to split the Chicago School chapter into 2 and then write another chapter after that. So, like, lots of stuff changes, and I didn't do it just because I felt that, just because I was like, well, reviewer number 2 said so, but because, ultimately I was interested in why Smith was a problem and why fights over Smith looked the way they did at different times. So Smith, the apostle of free trade, right, and weaponized on both sides of that debate. There's a lot of continuity in trade debates because even after slavery ends, people are still fighting over free trade and protectionism. So that let me trace continuity, but also because the kinds of questions and the kinds of engagements that people were having over Smith were also so heavily mediated by the discipline of political economy and economics. I had to tell that story too. So there wasn't just an academic Smith. It was like the academic Smith was the one that made it into Congress, and then the one that made it into Congress was the one that academics were also responding to, right, over time. And then the discipline of economics looked different, and so that became the Smith that made it out into the public sphere in the mid-20th century, and that's the one that scholars are responding to in the late 20th century. So it was, I wouldn't say it was accidental, but there was an organic development to how I ended up slicing up the story, because it would have been impossible to just be like, okay, well, I guess I'm hitting 1876 now and like just go through the library database. I actually triangulated. So I started where I knew there was material, which was in the 20th century Chicago School moment, and then I worked my way backwards.
I think we've got time for one last question.
Only if we have time.
Yeah, we definitely do.
It's kind of two devil's advocate questions, really, just to see where the bounds of the methodology, like how far we can push it in a way. The first is, does indirect influence come into reception history? So, for example, you say Locke in the 19th century, people were more interested in necessarily concerning human understanding than they were his political philosophy. But say somebody in the 1830s or 40s, or Dawn Rebellion or whatever in America, was talking about some of Locke's ideas, but they kind of got it from the Declaration of Independence, and in the authors, and I know this is a debatable point, but the authors of Declaration might have never read Locke. So it's like, is there any place for that kind of influence? And the second thing is, and I think I know what you're going to say for this, is there any worth in those people who still insist on saying someone is a Lockean liberal or a Burkean conservative who has never read Locke or Burke or to ever define themselves as liberal or conservative? Can you still say, okay, there are certain things in Burke, and I know they're loose and there are different interpretations, that blah, blah, all of this stuff. Can you still say there are recognized Burkean attributes and call someone Burkean conservative who would have never recognized that label at all, but use it in a kind of as a scholarly shorthand? Or should we just dispense with that altogether, the idea of a Lockean liberal?
So I love thinking about thinker adjectives. I have works in progress on the problem of the thinker adjective in intellectual history. And the short answer just is that I'm curious to hear what I might say. I don't think we need to abandon it. I don't think there's a problem in and of itself of saying that labeling someone a Lockean liberal. The problem is if we don't define what we mean by that adjective.
Yeah.
Right. And so if we, and this sort of defeats the point, is the whole purpose of the thinker adjective is shorthand for something that's sort of an assumed set about a commitment to minimal government or individual, whatever. But I think that, so in short, I don't have a problem with applying that as a designator as long as we define what we mean by it. I think we find that in the process of defining it, we actually have to complicate it, add complexity, and all of a sudden then the adjective itself doesn't become useful because we're just talking, about sort of it as it is. Yeah, I'm curious what.
I think that what I would say is if there is another word you could use that more just clearly describes your position, use that.
Yeah.
Because often, Burkean or whatever is just used in a very like I'm referencing something intellectual, and you kind of know what that means, blah, blah, blah. But actually it would be better if you just actually said what you were talking about or what you're referring to. And I think, like with Claire's point, I think that sometimes Burkean has meant very different things. Like for most of the 19th century, to be Burkean meant that you were like bonkers. It was like to be Burkean was to like go off into like flights of fancy and throw a knife on the floor of the House of Commons. And it wasn't like a positive thing, a bit like Locke in
the 19th century.
And it was only really later that Burkean became synonymous with like gradual reform or things like that. But like, okay, for example, in a book that you may or may not have read, but like John Burrow, who's a very famous intellectual historian, mainly worked on Britain, uses the word Burkean in lots of his work, but particularly in his book called The Liberal Descent, which is about historiography, basically to mean like gradual constitutional, like kind of English constitutional development, kind of gradual change. But he uses the word Burkean to say that.
It could have been got from
where like Burke did not invent English constitutionalism. So I think that sometimes it's better just to say what you mean, rather than obfuscate. So I think that if someone wants to say, I'm a Burkean conservative, and I have this Burke has this phrase where he sort of says, who now reads Bolingbroke, whoever read him through. I think about that on a daily basis because I always think like, who now reads Burke, who now reads Disraeli, whoever read him through. And I think it's that kind of, I think once Burkean or Disraelian or whatever, like, or Lockean comes to mean something, people don't engage with it, and it's to what extent the offhand reference actually just becomes a less engaged thing. It kind of represents less engagement rather than serious engagement. So yeah, like Claire, I think charting the use of the term is very interesting, but I wouldn't personally, I wouldn't call myself a Burkean conservative anyway, but like, even if I thought it was, yeah.
I'll take a stab at the first question about kind of indirect versus direct influence. So this was tricky. I remember thinking about, oh God, it turns out Charles Darwin was really into the theory of moral sentiments, and then somebody else was interested in Darwin's like study on animal feelings, and I'm like, oh, do I like, that's like 3 degrees of separation, like, do I go study that weird treatise on like animal feelings via Charles Darwin? It was like one of those serial killer maps, right? But fine. And ultimately what I decided on was, I mean, actually related to what you just said about kind of like the thinness of the intellectual content underneath somebody being like, I'm a disciple of Adam Smith, or I'm a Burkean, I'm a Smithian, I'm a Lockean. And for me, what's interesting about actually using that as an index for kind of what's going on in that moment, when suddenly people are pointing fingers and saying, I'm a disciple of Smith, or I'm not a disciple of Adam Smith, is that Smith stands for something. What is that thing he stands for? And why are people latching on to Smith? And so, I think one criticism is that I actually rely on a pretty narrow, or I would say pretty, I don't know, is it a low bar? Is it a high bar? The standard for me, for like what counts as kind of fight or an interesting point of investigation for Smith is when there are fights, right? Like when people are directly invoking Smith, they're quoting him and they're signaling some kind of allegiance or attachment or why they're engaging with him. And especially like in congressional debates, you start to see these patterns, right? And they're kind of like flashpoints where suddenly Smith is coming up again and again and again. And for me, even if people are getting Smith wrong or they're not really engaging with his ideas, what's significant is that he is a common reference point, right? And then saying, okay, well, why is he a common reference point? Why is he useful? What is actually taken from Smith? What's going on in the moment that is a useful political device says something more interesting than the kind of myth bunking or the debunking approach, which is like, okay, everybody's being called the Smithian, everybody's being called a Lockean, but you know what Locke really said, right? Like,
or like trying to trace echoes in
that's
famous people, where it's like, oh, this sounds a bit like what they said, which isn't really very convincing. So I think that's the indirect thing. But question is, I think we've all kind of decided to take that approach where it's about direct references, because otherwise it's just.
I think the other thing that the verbal echoes approach assumes is that you have a stable version of Burke, of Smith, or Locke by which you can determine good use, bad use, legitimate use, illegitimate use, right? Like appropriate legatee and inappropriate legatee of kind of the tradition, right? It assumes that there's kind of stable, coherent set of things belonging to Smith, Burke, and Locke that we're kind of like, well, I don't know, there's a kind of different Smith and a different Locke and a different Burke at different times and places. So I'll just stop it.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all our panelists and to all of you for your questions. There's some drinks outside, so let's go have a drink. Thank you.
Thank you.